Thanks everybody for being here for our third annual expert panel presentation. Both of our previous panels featured extraordinarily qualified speakers, and I'm certain you'll agree by the end of the day that today is going to be no exception. Okay, so now before I introduce Bob Coward, our first expert, let me share some personal and Princeton history associated with this topic. Way back in 1954, Admiral Rickover and his crew launched the first ever nuclear submarine. One of his top aides at that time was a fellow named Ted Rockwell, class of 47. 9 years later, Ted left Admiral Rickover and the nuclear Navy to establish an engineering company, MPR Associates, determined to help commercialize nuclear power. 4 years into that adventure, Ted recruited me here at Princeton University. By then, MPR Associates was already recognized as a world-leading specialty engineering and technical services company, especially in nuclear power. So our first speaker today, Bob Coward, succeeded me as principal officer of MPR. Bob graduated from Duke University, known as the Princeton of the South, with a degree in mechanical engineering. His career is focused on design, evaluation, development of nuclear power plants. Bob has worked over 100 electric generating plants worldwide, including 58 of the 65 US nuclear plant sites. So he knows a few things. He's recognized as a key industry leader who regularly serves blue ribbon panels in support of clients, industry groups, government agencies, addressing important design, regulatory, operational challenges regarding advanced reactor systems, safety system performance, new plant projects, including small modular reactors. Bob is a past president of the American Nuclear Society. Here's a suggestion. As you listen to Bob, pretend that you're a CEO of a major company, major utility, or maybe a decision maker in our government. And you need to decide what you need to do to fill our rapidly growing demand for nuclear power. Bob?
Thanks, Alex. It's good to be here. Alex asked me, have I ever been to Princeton? When was the last time I was at Princeton? And I told him that the last time I was at Princeton, I think was probably the spring of 1978 when I went to Jadwin Gym, because Princeton was my safe choice when I was getting out of high school. Yeah, you got to have that backup safe choice. And that was Princeton. As a New Jersey native, that was my backup safe choice. All right. What I'm going to try and do, and I'm going to both wander and use the podium, is lead off for Rick and Jack and Alex. I'm going to talk about, just sort of set some landscape. Where are we when we talk about, nuclear power in the United States, in particular the United States right now? Why, it's really been in the news a lot lately. Talk a little bit about why, talk about where we are, and just try and set a foundation for these gentlemen to go build on, to go a little bit deeper and talk about some technical and policy topics. Does that make sense? Does that work for everybody? So what I want to do is I just want to give you the upfront perspective, which is, first, I'll warn you, as Alex said, I'm a nuclear guy, so I'm not going to deny that. I believe in the technology. I believe in the benefits. I believe in the reasons why. I believe in the importance of it. I make no bones about that. But at the same time, people ask me why. And I say, it's all about the word security. And it's all different kinds of security: energy security, economic security, environmental security, national security. All of these threads weave through nuclear power. And in one way or another, our environment in this country, our standard of living, our economy, our national security, all energy, all these things, whether you realize it or not, are built upon the existing nuclear power program and rely on a thriving nuclear power program going forward. And so, that's why I think this is so important. And so where are we energy in this country? I think most people understand the basic concepts of where we are, which is for a variety of reasons, we're trying to both take advantage of the abundance of energy we have in this country. We're trying to embrace innovation. As a society, we're trying to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. We're trying to decarbonize the electricity grid, the energy system. We're trying to, at the same time, deliver more energy, more electricity, for example. If I'm decarbonizing a grid and I'm putting more load on it at the same time, I got, these are all like technical people probably, right? Mostly, all right? It's Princeton. So we got a two-axis problem. We're working in both two places. We're trying to decarbonize and we're trying to grow. And we're trying to push as much as we can to the electric system. And so that's the very big picture strategy, because we think that can provide a lot of benefits to society, to the country, to all of us. And so what do I need to think about as I go on this journey? Because remember, the energy system in this country, think about this for a second. The energy system in this country was largely built over about 150 years, overwhelmingly around fossil fuels. This country is trying to either refurbish, replace, or add. Different people use different numbers. 60 to 80% of that in like 15, 20 years, with minimal reliance on fossil fuels. That sounds like a challenge to me. And that's the challenge that's out there for all of us. So what's important as I go on this journey, all right? A lot of it revolves around electricity, the grid, especially when we're talking about nuclear, although we'll come back to that in a moment. I'll put out there, I'll just stipulate that the most valuable asset of the United States, of our entire economy and standard of living, everything we have in this country is built around the electricity grid. It's the most important thing we have. So we got to keep it reliable. We got to keep it resilient. We got to keep it cost effective as we grow it, all right? We're talking about adding a lot more sources, a lot more generation sources to the system, all right? We like to joke, the nuclear people, we like to joke, you think it's hard to permit a nuclear power plant? Go try to permit a transmission line, all right? It's even harder to permit a transmission line, all right? One of the things that's going on, decades ago, people would just equate nuclear power, nuclear energy with electricity generation. Build big nuclear power plants, they generate as much electricity as they can. All right, I drove up from Delaware this morning. I drove past the Salem and Hope Creek nuclear generating stations. You can see them from the Delaware Bridge if you've never noticed it before. The Hope Creek coolant tower. If you look out, you can see it from the bridge, all right? Big nuclear power plants generate as much electricity as I can. Well, wait a second, going forward, we're introducing lots of different, I'll use the phrase, use cases, all right? People are realizing I can use nuclear energy, nuclear power for a lot of different things. And perhaps one design doesn't fit all. And so one of the reasons why there's so many new designs out there being developed is there's a bunch of different use cases. There are people still trying to do big nuclear power plants for a lot of electricity generation. Has anybody here read the news? You ever heard of this outfit, X Energy? Put your hand up if you've heard of X Energy. They're one of the small modular reactor developers, right? They believe their primary business opportunity is actually generating heat, not electricity. So their design is focused on heat, all right? A number of people are trying to develop what we call micro modular reactors, right? MMRs. Imagine a box that gets built in a factory, gets put on a flatbed. The flatbed delivers it to the site. Crane picks it up, puts it on a pre-poured concrete pad, while one guy's tightening the anchor bolts, one guy's connecting the wires, one guy's downloading the app to control it, right? That's the vision for people. They want to deploy them all over West Texas. And they want to use those instead of diesel generators to power all the oil and gas rigs in the Permian Basin in West Texas. So just lots of opportunity. All right, so as we're moving down this path, what's important for all these things is finding the right, what we like to say, carrot and stick approach. It's pretty obvious that if I just beat on people, we ain't gonna get there. It's pretty obvious if I just get really super nice and just keep asking for please, put the carrot in front of them, that don't work either. We gotta find the balance. And it's all about cost and risk, right? In the end, all these decisions are commercial business arrangements. They're commercial decisions, so cost and risk matter. So that's where we are big picture, right? That's just sort of, setting the stage. And one of the things I want to point out, just give you a really quick, see, it's great talking to technical people because they appreciate and love curves and charts. So let's put a chart up here, all right? Because I want to make sure you walk away. If you walk away from anything here today, I want to make sure you walk away with this one. When we say renewable penetration, that's what fraction of the electricity grid comes from renewables, wind and solar. All right? Most of the country, we're back somewhere over here. We're moving right. And if I plot the overall system cost, not the cost of the solar panels, not the cost of the wind turbines, not even the cost of the electricity that comes out of the wind turbines, when I factor in things like operation and maintenance, but I look at the whole electricity system. How much does it cost? Dollars per megawatt hour or cents per kilowatt hour, if you want to use that rate. Yes?
Sorry, how are you defining the regional boundaries for the system cost?
I'm defining it as I'm generating electricity that's going to be delivered to customers. So I'm including things like generating it, I'm including transmission wires, I'm including maintenance of the entire system. I'm including if I need storage to keep some of the power, generate during the day and use at night. It's just everything I need to deliver the electricity to the customer. What you see is, like, as this curve back here has just a very subtle increase. All right, just partly because back here, the primary generation source of choice for the last 15, 20 years has been large combined cycle gas turbines. And they're just cheap as could be. All right. So as I start weaning myself off of those and weaning myself off of coal plants, you see the overall system cost starts going up a little bit. But a funny thing happens when you get to about 50 or 75%. And different people, some people think it's 50, some people think it's 60, some people think it's 75. We're not here to tell you what the exact number is. But in that range, that curve does that. Anybody know why?
Pay for backup.
I got to pay to, we use the phrase, firm the renewables. At the risk of sounding simple, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And the cost to ensure I have reliability and resiliency starts to just take off. Does that curve look like this curve? That's a peer-reviewed study that was done looking at what is that curve for Ireland. And if you look, here I'm at almost zero. At the right-hand side, I'm at 3%. We have a customer at NPR, a big utility, an investor-owned utility, who was trying to look at this themselves. And I'm not going to deny that they might have put their thumb on the scale a little bit. Back here, they're currently generating their system. They're currently generating electricity in the vicinity of $40 a megawatt hour. Costs more to transmit it, but they're generating about $40 a megawatt hour. Their conclusion, if they went to 100% wind, solar, and storage, was that $40 would become $29,000. All right? And so the role of nuclear, one of the roles of nuclear is basically because I control it. Well, I like to use the word dispatchable, right? I decide if it's going to run or not nature. It tends to have the effect of helping to pull this curve down out here. So that once I start getting out here and rather than having to buy more batteries to back up the wind and solar, I rely on the nuclear to keep that curve down. But the key takeaway from this is every time you read the news that all we need is wind, solar, and batteries, you got to get anxious and scared because that doesn't work. All right. So if you listen to what I've been talking about, there's a tremendous need in this country for energy. There's a need for energy that makes the system work. There's a need for all the various options and assets we can put together. And in order to avoid really extreme costs, most of us, I won't claim everyone, but most of us believe we need either significant expansion of nuclear power, reliable deployment of carbon capture sequestration. That's where on the back end of a coal plant or a gas turbine plant, I capture all the CO2 coming out and I store it someplace. I don't let it into the air. Or some sort of unforeseen orders of magnitude advances in energy storage. All right? There's some of us who think, realistically, given where the society is, given especially the last few years with this hunger for the AI data centers, we need all these things. And oh, by the way, a lot of these things, you drive around a lot of the cities in this country lately, a lot of this stuff needs to get replaced because a lot of it's getting old. So again, there's just tremendous need statement for energy. And we got to figure out how to do it together, all right? Working within the realities of our world, all right? NIMBY, everybody knows what NIMBY is, right? All right. Everybody know what banana is? I think it's all these orange shirts. But anyway, it's build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. All right? Nope, you know what nope is, right? Not on planet Earth. All right? The reality is, in nuclear space, 20 years ago, this was the biggest thing holding us back. Across most of the country today, when I go do similar talks, there are people standing up with an attitude. And overwhelmingly, they want to know why it ain't happening and why it ain't happening faster. Public perception has flipped. All right? Most of the public across most of the country now desires and wants nuclear power. They're not afraid of it. So you can see that sort of the opportunity is building up for us. And we say, why? I love this chart. This came out of something that DOE put out a couple of years ago. They called it their liftoff report, where they looked at, what are the value attributes of a number of different sources of energy? And what they saw was that when you think about things like dispatchable, firm, clean, land use, boy, land use matters, need for transmission, economic benefits, all these things, what they saw was nothing rises to the surface like nuclear. Nothing does, right? That's why there's so much interest. But at the same time, we also need to be realists. And what the other part of this equation, or the other part of the story is, we're not as dark green when it comes to cost. So as a community, as an industry, that's one of the big things we're working these days, is how do we reduce the cost? How do we make these projects, these facilities swallowable to the customers from a cost and risk standpoint? All right. As I mentioned before, the other reason people are showing more and more interest in nuclear is just all the different use cases. It's not just producing large amounts of electricity anymore. It's providing energy in a bunch of different ways. That's what's drawing everybody to the word nuclear. We've got this new nuclear thing. We got the old nuclear thing. A lot of people ask, what's the same? What's different? I'll just tell you that the key things are, think of not rapid, but large advances in safety margins, safety management approaches. Most of, not all, but most of the new designs either are or come very close to the infamous walk-away safe, where you don't need a lot of special safety systems. Actually, they're designed, many of these new nuclear power plants designs, they're developed so if something strange or bad happens, actually the best thing you can do is not touch anything. Just let Mother Nature take its course, all right? Because they're walk-away safe. Can generate heat. The lessons, the need statements, looking at what is beneficial The designers over the last 10 or 20 years, they have factored those things into these forward-looking designs. One of the best examples is, this is example is the X-energy machine. This is a high-temperature gas reactor. Most nuclear power plants today that are operating, they have a big reactor vessel full of water inside a very large containment building, concrete walls 4, 5, 6 feet thick, all right, to protect it. The X-energy machine, instead of a big reactor vessel full of water, it's a big reactor vessel full of fuel pebbles about the size of a billiard ball that are flowing and they're dumped in the top and they come out the bottom one at a time and then they put it back in the top. And that billiard ball has thousands of tiny little uranium fuel pellets, fragments, embedded in the ball. And the ball is made out of graphite and ceramic. And the ball is the containment. So instead of having to build this big building, 100 feet tall, 120 feet tall, 100 feet in diameter with 5-foot thick concrete walls, I just built a regular building to protect this machine from the environment, because the fuel pebble, the ball, that's actually not just the fuel, but it's the containment. And I just offer that as one example of how when you start allowing your mind to think, okay, how can I take advantage of that? What can I do here, right? If I don't, clearly it's got to reduce the cost and make it safer. Maybe I'm onto something here. Those are the kinds of directions people are moving in. And so when the small modular reactor, new nuclear thing started probably about 10 years ago in earnest, 12 years ago, I like to tease my friends and peers that because in the end, we're like you, we're just engineers at heart and we can't help ourselves. And so people started coming up with these new designs. And the engineers would go to the engineers at the customers, the utilities, and they would talk about the safety margins. And they talk about these nifty things that they're building into this design. And the engineers at the customers would say, wow, I want one. And so they keep working. And then a few years later, when people started thinking more about transmission and moving energy around, they started talking to what I'll call the system operators, not just the people who operate the power plants, but the people who operate the whole energy system. And they started talking about phrases that you might understand, like load following, a machine that automatically follows the load on the grid, not just is set at one value. They talked about other functionality built into it that makes it easier to manage the grid. And all the system operators said, wow, oh man, yeah, I want one. So they kept working. Then as it all kept building and getting even more serious, probably 2 or 3 years ago, they all got to the CEOs and the CFOs who actually make the decisions to buy and sign the contracts. And what a lot of people realized was the CEO, he doesn't care about the technology. He doesn't care about the nifty features. He doesn't care about the functionality. He or she cares only about the cost and the risk involved. They just stipulate to the idea it's going to be great, that you're going to give me something good. How much is it going to cost? What's the risk I'm taking on? What does it mean to me commercially? And we hit a wall. We simply hit a wall, all right? Things slowed down because the CEOs just did not have the confidence. Many people have heard of Vogtle 3 and 4, the new nuclear power plants that came online in Georgia over the last couple of years. Tremendous accomplishment, tremendous. The people involved should be proud what they got, taking that new design, that new technology, getting it done, getting it working, and it's working well. And at the same time, we have to face the reality that, unfortunately, that project reinforced basically every negative perception people have of our industry. It cost more than twice as much as it was supposed to cost, took more than twice as long as it was supposed to take. All right? We just can't tolerate that. That's the problem we ran into, is the CEO saying, why is this not going to be Vogel? Right? And then the typical CEO perspective, on the customer side, the typical CEO perspective is, I will buy it from you as soon as you show me one working. Well, how do I show you one working if nobody will buy it from me? I got this stalemate, right? That's where we've been for the last few years. It all started changing about 18, 24 months ago, when people like Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, who am I missing? I feel like there's another one. When they all started imagining how much energy are they going to need to power their data centers? Where are they going to get it? And they realized they were going to have to step in themselves and help cause and create the outcomes we all want. And so they stepped in and said to this, they've said to the CEOs, we'll give you some money. We don't like it, but we'll give you some money. We'll pay above market rates if that will help you get over the hump to go do this. And so that's what's going on right now, is probably seen some of the things in the news where there's some announcements, but the hyperscalers, they're driving what's going on right now, not the utilities, the hyperscalers. Who here bought something from Amazon 10 years ago? All right. Who delivered it? UPS, probably correct. Who bought something from Amazon last week? Who delivered it? Amazon. Why? What happened? What changed?
Economies of scale.
What?
Economies of scale. It's cheaper for them to deliver it.
No. About 10 or 12 years ago, Amazon realized that their business had the potential to scale faster than UPS and FedEx could support, and that they were going to be constrained by a subcontractor. And they decided that they had to go develop their own to avoid their business being constrained. Then once they did it, they made it efficient. The same thing has happened in the last 24 months. The big hyperscalers have decided they simply don't trust the utilities to give them the energy they need, and they're going to have to go create it themselves. In terms of what is the industry working on, we're working on reducing the cost, reducing the risk, increasing confidence, building the credibility, so that we can confidently deliver these projects. This, you can see these slides later, just examples of some of the more recent announcements. And as I said at the beginning, this is really important. All right, we're at the precipice. We've got the need, we have the opportunity, we have the solution. The challenge right now is connecting all that together to enable the delivery of that solution at a cost and a risk profile that works for the customers, so that all of society can benefit for it. And it's really important. And I think these two gentlemen will start talking about how do we get that connection, how do we create that outcome so that we can all benefit from it. All right?
Okay, thank you, Bob. For the folks standing in the back, there are some scattered seats over here, a couple on the right, one in the corner there. All right, next speaker is Rick Mott. He graduated from the great Princeton class of '73. You can tell from the jacket. Electrical engineering. Rick spent a career designing software and signal processing electronics for X-ray spectrometry. He's been granted 7 U.S. patents and co-inventor for 5 more. He led the engineering team at Princeton Gamma Tech, which received 2 R&D 100 awards in '94 and '96. A Princeton Gamma Tech detector at a nuclear power plant in Sweden was the first one outside the Soviet Union to recognize the Chernobyl accident when it happened. Rick is also the initiator of this expert panel. This is his work to put all this together. And one of the stories that maybe you can share is that some years ago, maybe more than 10 years ago, Rick suggested to the university that it's time to build a small nuclear power plant here. to power the university needs. Well, he was greeted with skepticism, perhaps, on the basis of technically maybe that makes sense, but politically, forget it. All right. So here's my suggestion. As you listen to Rick describe the overly conservative basis for regulating nuclear power, ask yourself, if what he says is true, my gosh, why aren't we doing something about it? Rick?
Okay, thank you, Alex. The other story I will share with you very briefly is that in the aftermath of Fukushima, the Earth Day after Fukushima, my kids' elementary school allowed me to give a talk on nuclear power. And this is a Quaker K through 8 school. I'm talking to 7th and 8th graders here. And I open up with a question. How many of you would be terrified to live within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant? All the hands go up, including the science teacher, by the way. I said, surprise, you all do. New Jersey gets about half its power from Oyster Creek. Look around the room. I don't see anybody with two heads. Things must be okay, sort of. So I have 20 minutes to convince you that the regulatory regime we have is based on an assumption that was made with no scientific backing. And it has crept into every aspect, not only of nuclear power, but of chemical carcinogenesis. Science. Science is a good thing. We like science. I should warn you, these slides are very dense, and I'm not going to read them to you. Just skim the stuff that's highlighted in green. You'll be good enough. There will be a link at the end to tell you where you can download a copy for yourself. I can give you the short version of the talk in 2 words. Planck wins this one. So we all know that at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, it was declared to be not airborne, that it was spread by droplets, hence the whole 6-foot thing and the cloth masks and so on and so forth. This is the same playbook that was used in the 1918-1920 flu. The hero of our story is an engineer. He happens to be a Harvard engineer, but for this purpose, we can forgive that, okay? Who showed in 1936 that influenza could hang in the air for hours and also invented ultraviolet purification of the air. Harvard responded appropriately to someone without a PhD with the temerity to conflict with the public health authorities of the day. They fired him in 1938. But he went to Penn and discovered that tuberculosis was also airborne. And the public health authorities bought that, but they bought that because it's a tiny spore, smaller than 5 microns, has to go deep in the lungs to infect you, but nothing else. And that 5 micron limit stuck around for the entire intervening time to bite us once again in 2019. So radioactivity. There are several kinds. We don't have to worry about all their properties. The only thing we care about is that it is ionizing radiation, which means it is capable of breaking the chemical bonds, including the ones that make up our DNA. Radiation and cancer is what we fear. It is the thing that generates the opposition to nuclear power that has had NGOs over the past decades basically misusing the theory that I'll talk about in a second to make you as scared as they possibly can. The kind of damage we're interested in is what's called the double strand break. It's the middle of the upper chart. It's where the DNA is actually separated into 2 pieces. That is the one which is now known to be most likely to cause the kind of mutation that causes cancer. Now, I am not a biology major, so if all of you people know more about that than I do, I'm going to skim over this real light. We're going to use millisieverts, which is a unit of radiation that basically smooths all those differences in behavior. But the one I want to point out is that the alpha particle, which is a big, heavy thing and deposits its energy very, very quickly, like within 50 microns. If you look at the lower illustration, you can see why alpha particles have roughly a factor of 20 greater biological damage than the other types of radiation. So the idea is called the linear no threshold theory. If you have ever heard of that, what it is in the 20s, when science was looking for an explanation for how evolution actually worked, Hermann Muller discovered the ability to create mutations in fruit flies by blasting them with huge doses of X-rays. And immediately, somebody had the idea that, hey, maybe low levels of natural radiation can be the cause of evolution. And again, we are looking at how the damage to the DNA might occur. There's two ways. It can either hit the DNA directly, or it can ionize a water molecule, as in the lower illustration. And what that does is produce a hydroxyl radical and a hydronium ion. These are called reactive oxygen species. You've probably heard about those because our supermarket and drugstore shelves are filled with 21st century snake oils called antioxidants. But basically, the idea was that a single hit, a single event close to DNA can cause the damage, and therefore the total risk is cumulative over a lifetime. The only problem is we are evolutionarily pretty different from fruit flies. So the linear no threshold hypothesis should have been a somewhat controversial topic, but at the time in 1956 of the BEAR-1 panel, that's biological effects of atomic radiation, it's still around, but they don't like the word atomic, so now it's biological effects of ionizing radiation. There was a panel convened, and the Rockefeller Foundation was basically the funding authority at that time. They worked with Mueller. They stacked the panel with a bunch of geneticists who were already bought into the LNT hypothesis, and so it was just read into the record and accepted. So it just became policy. There's no science behind that. There was actually good science being done by a guy named Russell at Argonne National Laboratories. The million mouse experiment, which did not show linearity, but that was simply ignored. That's still a live topic, so if at some point, if you get the slides, you should check some of those references at the bottom. So let's see if LNT is true. We can attempt to do a hypothesis test here. When the EPA started regulating radon, a smart physicist at Pitt thought, there's going to be publicly available information here on smoking prevalence, on radon concentrations, and on lung cancer. So he decided to go ahead and test that. And he did it early on with the plot on the left. It's interesting, but there's pretty wide confidence bands there. He got a lot of pushback, of course, because this is what's called an ecological study, which doesn't mean what it means in environmental science. In epidemiology, what it means is you don't know the individual doses. But the linear threshold theory is an ecological hypothesis by definition. If you know the average, you know what the cancer rate is going to be, and it doesn't matter how it's distributed. So the mathematically astute among you will notice that the plot on the left, which was done with many, many times more data and 15 years, those lines go in different directions, which is, the risk of 6 picocuries per liter, which is the way you measure radon, was lower than what's expected by the linear no threshold hypothesis as given by a uranium miner study from NAS by 7 orders of magnitude. 6 orders of magnitude is 1 chance in a million that that's wrong. So that is actually very strong evidence. There was a study done of the nuclear shipyard workers because there was a report of potential leukemia among the workers who overhauled the reactors. And so a really strong study was done. 70,000 participants, 35,000 in each arm, 10 times the amount that normally goes into a pharmaceutical study. And 437 pages later, no significant dose response from the radiation. But there was something interesting. All-cause mortality actually declined. If you could put this in a pill, there would be a couple of really happy pharma shareholders out there. So now let's go to an area of India that has very high background radiation, something like 14 times the US average, which is about 3 millisieverts a year. And they did a large study. Again, the doses were measured. They went into people's houses. They put dosimeters up. And the largest, the highest dose group here runs about, call it 700 millisieverts over the course of the study, 19 years. And there was absolutely no significant increase in cancer. In fact, if you plotted a line through the tops of those blue bars, it would be slightly declining. And that's outside the confidence limits. The 1.4 part of the plot there is what would be predicted from linear no threshold. So now let's look at yet another example. These are all examples of accidental exposures, inadvertent exposures, because obviously you can't do a controlled study on something that is known to cause harm. In Taiwan, there were apartments buildings built with steel contaminated with cobalt-60. Cobalt-60 is a gamma emitter with a half-life of about 5 years. And these people got enormous doses by our standards. The cumulative doses in the high dose range, 4,000 millisieverts. Between 6 and 10 millisieverts will kill you outright in a matter of weeks if it kind of hits you all at once. So they're getting half a nominal lethal dose. And again, not only do they not have the expected level of cancers actually go down. So this is not the strongest evidence we have. This is the strongest evidence we have. The radium dial patters. Everybody knows this story. Women used to make the luminescent dials in the 20s with radium paint, and they would use their lips to point their brushes to get a nice fine line there. And they ingested huge amounts of radium. The upper chart there, the x-axis is logarithmic. You are covering 5 orders of magnitude of cumulative dose. So the linear no threshold line, the red line, becomes an exponential rise. The first woman to actually contract cancer out of 50 received a dose of minimum 190,000 millisieverts. That's 27 times the dose that is expected to be 100% probability of cancer, according to LNT. So if a cat has 9 lives, this lady was good for at least 3 cats. That's the new unit we should consider here. So that suggests that that LNT probably isn't right for exposures over long periods of time, because everything we know about it came from the atomic bomb survivors, which is an acute exposure all at once. That's what we study, and I'll mention that in a moment. So why is it that LNT isn't right? Unlike fruit flies, we evolved to fix our DNA. And what we saw is that, or there were, let's say some Nobel Prize was awarded in 2018 for repair mechanisms. And that's due to our oxygen metabolism. Oxygen metabolism is a good thing. It lets us get large, and we burn fuel to keep ourselves warm all the time. And our conventional regular metabolism creates something like 50 double-strand breaks a day. The human cell division time is approximately a day, so that's a convenient time unit to use. And 2 millisieverts a day, that's 2/3 of a year's background every day, would add less than 0.1% to that. Our senses can't detect radiation, but in fact, our cells do. This is a fairly amazing piece of science. Those frames in the upper set of images are actually frames of a time-lapse video tagging the radiation repair protein complexes. And the plot D there shows its evolution over time. The time axis is again logarithmic. So these things reach a peak within 15, 20 minutes, but the double strand breaks can take up to 10 or 12 hours to fix. And you can see that those complexes are actually fairly large. So what causes the chance of developing a misrepair is if 2 ionization events happen within a single volume of a repair complex. Then the repair complex makes errors. Single double-strand breaks are handled pretty well. So we need a better hypothesis. The better hypothesis that takes account of the fact that 2 events have to happen simultaneously in order to cause the problem puts us in the realm of combinatorics. And combinatorics, generally, the integral of that does not turn out to be a straight line. It turns out to be an S-shaped curve, a sigmoidal curve. This is an example called the birthday problem, which some of you may have heard of. If you were asked to guess how many people had to be in a room like this before 2 of them had a 50-50 probability, there was a 50-50 chance that at least 2 had the same birthday. A lot of people would guess on the order of 180, half a year? The actual answer is 23. And the reason the answer is 23 is because you're doing a pairwise comparison between all 23 of those people. And so you actually have a very large number very quickly. This is the same kind of problem we're trying to use to explain the actual risk of cancer from radiation, having to have two events happen within a cubic volume that's the size of a repair complex. So here is the atomic bomb survivor data. The Radiation Effects Research Foundation has been studying the survivors for their entire lives. And this is the data from which the linear no threshold theory is, on which that is based. The big curve in the center is various attempts to make the lower end of the curve fit below, call it 500 millisieverts. It's mostly a blob of data that's hard to interpret. The plot on the left is the sigmoidal no threshold fit using what's called a 5-parameter logistic function. And it turns out that 5-parameter logistics is what you use for dose response everywhere except radiation safety. So we want to look at the very, very low end of this curve. The little one in the center, that is the lowest single millisievert of the risk curve. And if you look at it, you see that those numbers are really tiny. You're looking at 10 to the minus 7, 10 to the minus 8. And if you look at a tenth of a millisievert on the big log plot, you find that you got about 1 in 100 million chance of developing cancer from a tenth of a millisievert versus 1 in 100,000 under LNT. And so you wonder if that can possibly be true. Well, the best way to check is to look at the Indian data for the high background region, because it's a roughly comparable 0.11 millisieverts. If you treat each daily dose of the high background region as a single acute dose, and you calculate the cumulative probability that you should get a cancer out of that, you get roughly 100 million person days. And I'll show you this kind of calculation in a second here. So if we plot the blue curve, which is the sigmoidal no threshold, and the red curve on the radium painter dial data, what we see is that the SNT curve is still reasonably conservative. It is above 0 everywhere, but it's much, much higher than the first person who develops cancer is out there at 10, basically, 10 grays. So it's not a bad scheme. It's a drop-in replacement for the one that is used now. Excuse me one moment. So now what we want to do is find a way to calculate lifetime risk. And what we do is we use what's called a dose rate profile, because for most exposures, the dose rate isn't constant except for the background, okay? The first woman who actually contracted cancer, she accumulated her radium dose over a decade between 1915 and 25 up to a maximum of 16 millisieverts a day. We're switching to dose rate now. We're switching to millisieverts a day, not cumulative millisieverts. And then that decline in the blue curve is not due to the radioactive decay. It is due to biological decay. Radium is slowly excreted from the body with a half-life of about 40 years. So the cumulative risk that we get under SNT for a lifetime with that situation is about 62%. But in fact, only one of 49 women in that same dose category actually wound up with cancer. So that says is it's conservative enough to actually use. We can replace the existing estimate with this, and we're not doing anything that should scare anyone. So let's look at the second worst nuclear disaster in history and see if anything would have been any different using the SNT risk curve instead of the one that was actually used. The fission product we worry about most is iodine-131. It has an 8-day half-life. The assumption, or rather the Japan Atomic Energy Agency estimated that nearly 90% of what caused that big plume that went from the plant up and to the left in the bottom map there was iodine. and there was some cesium as well. The actual dose, the peak of the red curve is 40 microsieverts per hour, which translates to about a millisievert a day. That's in the sort of far upper left corner of the plot. The curve drops, of course. It declines exponentially, and it flattens out at the bottom because then the longer-lived cesium isotopes start becoming dominant. So that's what we are looking at here. But let's calculate a risk curve exactly like what we did for the radium finger lady. You have to convert from air dose, which is what you see in the red curve, because people don't spend their lives leaning on a radiation monitor. They go inside, they go outside, they live their lives. And so approximately for 50 microsieverts an hour in the town of Okuma, which is the one in which the plant is located, you're right next to the power plant. That was about the highest dose that was seen there. And if you assume 0.38 millisieverts a day for the first 5 days, and then the declining of the iodine that I talked about, so day 11, you're down to 0.28 millisieverts. In 50 days, you are down to the gray line there. And the gray line is 0.11 millisieverts a day. And that is the average dose of the high background region in India with no excess cancers over 19 years. Nobody was allowed to return to Okuma for 8 years. In 2 months, their risk was no higher than the high background area of injury. If we do what's called life loss expectancy, which is a standard way in the insurance world of compensating for industrial accidents, the total life loss expectancy under SNT for Fukushima is measured in days. The vertical axis there is days, not weeks, not months, not years. The highest exposed, highest risk group that they looked at for this study was less than 2 days of lost life expectancy if they had basically done nothing, carried on with their lives, not evacuated. It turns out that there was a calculation made by Mr. Oka of the effects of the evacuation of Fukushima. Even measured against the LNT expectation, he predicted that the evacuation itself cost 5 million days of lost life expectancy. And LNT says there would have been roughly 1.9 million that would be saved by the evacuation. In fact, under SNT, it's 2,200, more than 2,000 times less. So the fear kills people, right? It's not a good thing. And that's just premature deaths. We aren't even talking about the stress, the misery of being forced out of your home. And it didn't have to happen. It turns out that if the fear hadn't been baked into the Japanese legal structure, Fukushima might have been no worse than 3 Mile Island. It required the prime minister's permission to vent, do what's called venting the reactor. That means releasing radioactive material, but not terribly much, okay? And what caused the explosion at Fukushima was not, of course, nuclear. It was buildup of hydrogen gas. When the fuel is exposed and the fuel gets very, very hot, it can split water, generate hydrogen. The hydrogen builds up, and eventually it goes boom. The other 2 explosions essentially resulted from not being able to vent before the first one, because it destroyed the generator that was just supplying power to generate the cooling water for the other 2 things. So basically, the 7 hours between the time the plant operator requested the ability to vent and the permission came down was enough to cause the major releases in Fukushima. So, thank you for listening. I've got a link at the bottom that will tell you where you can get a copy of this if you want to snap a phone photo of that. And I thought hard about the second takeaway point that I made there. I was wondering if that was maybe a little too harsh. And the quote from Lauriston Taylor convinced me that that was not true, where he says that LNT is a deeply immoral use of our scientific legacy. That word immoral just leaped out at me. There are groups out there that are using your fear to generate, donations, memberships, and people. It's just like what we see in our political environment now. What I'm hoping you'll take away from this is that we should not be nearly as scared of nuclear power as has been soaked into you for the last 7 decades. Thank you very much.
Grand finale speaker, Jack Spencer. As you can tell from the title of his recently published book, Nuclear Revolution, Powering the Next Generation, Jack doesn't pull his punches. He's also the host of Power Hour podcast and a senior research fellow for energy and environment at the Center of Energy, Climate, and Environment at the Heritage Foundation, specializing in domestic and international nuclear energy policy. Jack publishes on numerous issues relating to nuclear energy and is Heritage's go-to expert on nuclear waste management, nuclear technology and fuel, energy subsidies, international approaches to nuclear energy. And here's my suggestion. As you listen to Jack, I hope that more than a few of you will embrace the challenges that he poses and the ideas deeply enough to push his recommendations and his thoughts with your most influential friends. Jack?
Thanks, Alex. I was already intimidated following these guys. I mean, these guys have special knowledge. And then Alex, you saying grand finale. I don't know about any of that. Here's the thing, I'm a policy guy. And I would argue policy of all this stuff is maybe the most impactful, but by far the least important. If it weren't for bad policy, or I would argue policy in general, these guys wouldn't have to be giving presentations because nuclear power plants would be affordable and LNT wouldn't be the basis on which our low dose radiation standards are based. But nonetheless, policy pervades everything and it gives guys like me something to talk about. And that's what I'm going to do here for the next 15 or so minutes. So I'm Jack Spencer. I wrote a book, do a podcast, but more than that, I study nuclear energy policy. What I'm going to talk about today is some of the policies that got us to where we are, why they're there, and how government has used different policies in the past to try to promote nuclear, to move it forward, how we're seeing history repeat itself, and why I think it's the wrong way to do it. Now, here's another caveat. Me giving this talk today would be like the day before Archduke Ferdinand the day after he was assassinated, and someone giving a speech on, are we sitting in a tinderbox? Because President Trump issued a series of executive orders yesterday that arguably do change the policy. They certainly change the policy landscape. Whether they change the future or not, I don't know, but certainly they give an opportunity. And I will reference some of those things as I go through this. But anyway, here's some numbers. There's 440 reactors operating around the world. The United States has 94. They produce about a little less than 20% of our electricity. That's been about where it's been for a while now. Canada has 19, just to give you a sense of what's here in North America. And there's a bunch under construction. You'll see, though, that most of them are in China and Russia. India's building some. Turkey's building some, but we're not building any. Not a whole lot being done in sort of Western democracies, but there's lots of interest. And why is that? There's competitiveness reasons. They're safe. We've heard about LNT. I'll talk a little bit more about that. They're adaptable. They can be used for almost anything. Like if you have a power requirement, if you got a problem, an energy problem, a power problem, nuclear can help solve it. And it has a ton of environmental benefits. I'll talk a little bit about each of these more. On the competitiveness side, I would point to two things. This slide's a little bit of a misnomer because I just have one side. This would be the foreign policy side. But on the domestic side, I won't go into it because we already talked about it, but just to mention, we have a ton of power needs, whether it's for AI and tech or manufacturing, just turning the lights on, a lot of power needs. We're having aging infrastructure, and that's not even to mention this effort to transition from a hydrocarbon-based system to something else. I don't know how successful or worthwhile that is. That's a different story, but still, we need a lot of power. But there's this competitiveness side on the international front. Here's the thing. A lot of people are interested in nuclear energy, and countries are investing in it, and they're building it. And over the last couple of decades, Russia's led that effort. Russia, they're the ones, if you need a nuclear reactor, they're the guys you would call up to get it built. China's coming up hot on their heels. China has built more reactors in the last handful of years than anyone else. And though they're not, they're starting to export, they, as a matter of policy, want to lead exports. And by all, what it looks like, they are able to do that. Now, if it was just the regular world, that'd be fine with me. I enjoy the competition. Bring it on and let's go compete. But it's not a regular world, not with these guys, because what they offer that we can't, we can't. South Korea, we'll talk a little bit more about them. They can't, they're an exporting country. What we can't offer that they can is the full spectrum of nuclear services, so everything from fuel to waste management. So what that gives them is not just you go build a reactor and leave, and where the country is operates it, and they're good. It gives you a 100-year relationship, not just a diplomatic one, but one where that country, where Russia or China builds a reactor, becomes dependent on Russia and or China, and that's a big issue, and one that that we need to face. And the way we face that, given this interest in nuclear energy, is we become competitive as well. And that's why that's really important for us to sort of wrap our heads around, that we need to be able to go off and convince other countries that they should buy our reactors. We talked about safety already, but this is a stat I like to point out. As Bob pointed out, new reactors are much safer, but the starting point was already really, really, really safe, like so safe that no one in the United States has ever been even as much as sickened as a result of radioactive release. I like to point out that the first 10 reactors are as safe as the last 10 reactors, which are as safe as everyone in between. This is a really, really safe technology, and it's only getting safer. And they're especially safe in the United States, something that Rick pointed out. In Japan, when these reactors were literally on the threshold of exploding, not the nuclear part, but the hydrogen, and they had to call the prime minister to see if they could vent to do that. That would never happen in the United States. In the United States, the person who is in charge of that nuclear reactor, the private individual he can shut it down at any time for any reason, for whatever. Safety, the person who's in charge of a U.S. nuclear power plant, their ultimate responsibility is safety, and they are completely authorized to do that. You just wouldn't have something like what happened there happen here. And that's why we have this unbelievable safety record. Adaptability. I won't go into it because we're short on time. We already talked about it a little bit, just to say that nuclear is this amazing thing. Like, it produces electricity, but it produces heat, and heat's what's used in the petrochemical industry and all sorts of industries, plastics. When we first started thinking about nuclear, they wanted to use nuclear even in cars and airplanes. I'm not saying they're going to be building nuclear cars and airplanes, but I'm not saying they're not either. What I'm saying is that the technology is there for, it's almost limitless in what it can do. Here's one of the slides I like to use to show the environmental benefits. It just uses a whole lot less land than other things. Now, I'm not one to look at this slide and just say, just because you use less land, it necessarily makes you better for the environment, or that that should be the single thing that we look at. What the land would otherwise be used for. There are all sorts of different variables that go into consideration, but you got to at least acknowledge that this is a pretty significant thing from that perspective. But it's not just land use. It emits, a lot of folks are concerned about CO2. A lot of folks are concerned about particulate pollutants, the criteria pollutants that EPA regulates, like particulate matter and SOx and NOx. It also emits none of that into the atmosphere. It's really an amazing technology in that the waste that it produces, literally in your whole, if you use nothing but nuclear energy for your whole life, the waste that you produce throughout that whole time would fit into a can of soda. If all of the nuclear waste that we've produced in the United States as a society would fit on a football field about 10 yards high, volumetrically, that's all that it's produced over the last 70 years. So a lot of benefits to it. Now, this has given rise to what I call these moments in nuclear. The first was this sort of era when we were discovering nuclear power, the Atoms for Peace program. Everyone was excited about nuclear. They were even going to build nuclear cars, as I mentioned before. And there were reasons for that. There was expanding energy demand at the time. There was the promise of affordability. You've probably heard the promise of it being too cheap to meter. The first president of the Atomic Nuclear Society said that. But here's a little footnote of history you might not know. He was not talking about nuclear fission energy at the time. What he was actually talking about was fusion. Everyone thinks he was talking about fission, so we'll just say it was going to be too cheap to meter. The national security aspect was really what was driving it. I mean, you had Rickover with the need for submarines, of course, nuclear weapons and all that. And what those guys were thinking was that not that we need a commercial nuclear industry, or that a commercial nuclear industry would help develop the industrial base to support those national security things, and that they would feed off of each other. And all of that got sort of mixed together. And then there was this era of technological innovation. But it didn't work out. I mean, it kind of worked out. We got 100 reactors out of it. We also got 150 reactors that were going to be ordered that never were built. We got escalating costs. We got a lot. What we didn't get was a economically sustainable, independent nuclear industry. And that was for a number of reasons. The regulation expanded, the energy crisis in the 70s, things like that. Interest rates went up. All these things helped kill that first burst of interest in nuclear energy. But what didn't go away were those things that I talked about earlier. The promise of nuclear energy was still, the promise of affordability was still environmentally clean, it's still secure, all of those things. And that gave rise to a series of policies to try to mitigate some of those costs that emerged out of that first nuclear moment to help give rise to a second nuclear moment. One of the big things, sort of the poster child of the first nuclear moment not working, was a reactor that was totally built, and then when they tried to get it permitted to operate, they couldn't get the permit. And it's a function of a lot of things, but one of the things it was a function of was the permitting process, where it was a two-step program. You got your permit to build it, to construct it, and then you got a separate permit to operate it. So in the 1990s, as a function of regulatory reform, they put together, they combined that system so you could get both things at the same time. And that was really the regulatory foundation that helped give rise to what became known as the nuclear renaissance. So that was the regulatory reform. There were some other things. You had raising electricity prices. That was before fracking. You had the environmental benefits. And everyone got excited about nuclear energy. We're going to build 30 reactors were submitted to the NRC to begin construction. I made a movie called Powering America. I was so excited. I shouldn't say I made it. I oversaw the production of it at the Heritage Foundation. I pointed out here, not just for this, but also it's a great documentary. If you just want a straight documentary on nuclear power, sort of a romp through the nuclear industry without a policy bias. I mean, it's pro-nuclear, but not overtly in your face pro-nuclear. We went from uranium mines and milling facilities into reactors to waste management facilities, and just to show how it all works. And what you're looking at here is this picture here is a unique one. As a non-nuclear engineer, not someone who builds or operates plants, this is a look straight down into the pressure vessel of Watts Bar Nuclear Power Plant, which at the time had begun construction many years earlier. They had stopped and restarted it again. And this is a view that not many people get to see. And anyway, this QR code, you can watch that movie for free if you are at all interested. Now, one of the things, in addition to those other pieces, there was a lot of government support for nuclear. Now, the private sector was moving nuclear forward because of the demand and because of the regulatory reforms. But government does what government does, and if they see something good happening, they got to do some more. And so there was government support for the nuclear renaissance, and the main policy vehicle for that was the Energy Policy Act of 2005 that subsidized around 6 reactors. The whole idea then was to get the industry started, kickstart it, then it would take off. The nuclear renaissance would happen. I hate subsidies. I don't like any of them. I don't like government intervention into the economy. The economy to me is my church and state. I think that the two should be separate. But even I sort of bought into this back then because I thought the government's been screwing this whole thing up. Yeah, give them a little help to kickstart it. They provided loan guarantees, cost share programs, insurance against regulatory delays. So if costs went up because of regulatory delays, there was some money for that. And then the thing that I hate most probably, which is the tax credits, production tax credits for nuclear. So what happened? You had demand, everyone excited, and you had government help. Let's see what the results of that were. We got a lot of private investment, a ton of private investment. We see now almost every day a new MOU is signed. We saw a slide earlier about all these things. All that was happening back then too. But more, you had, like I said, 30 reactors going to be built that NRC was permitting. You had modular facilities being built in Virginia and Louisiana. You had enrichment facilities being built planning to be built in Idaho. Just all over, all kinds of stuff. We got 2 very expensive reactors as a result, and 2 reactors that were started that failed. You had overinvestment across the nuclear sector. The nuclear boom became a bust. And that's because subsidies giveth and subsidies taketh away. That's the problem with all of this, is that the subsidies create a mirage over the actual economics. They hide the underlying issues that give rise to the need for the subsidies to begin with. They help the near-term economics, but do nothing to fix the underlying issues. They hide the market signals that are absolutely essential to guide our way to success. The nuclear industry has always stood with not always, it used to stand with both feet in government. And then the Atomic Energy Act removed one of those feet and allowed it to be commercialized. But that second foot has never been fully put into the private sector. It's always stood with one foot in each. And that's just a really difficult way to build a business. It's a really difficult way to build a business if your competitor is hydrocarbons and they're cheap. And when the subsidies go away, the underlying issues stay in place. And that's exactly what happened with EPAC 2005. So what are those underlying issues? One is nuclear waste. It's not a technical issue. I would argue it's not even an economic issue. It's purely a political issue. In 1982, the federal government took control over nuclear waste. And since 1982, we've not gotten one step closer to resolving the nuclear waste issue. In fact, I would argue we've gotten further and further away from it, because by taking that responsibility away from the federal government or away from the private sector, the people who produce the waste, you undermine the incentive to do anything about it, because politicians do what politicians do, which is nothing. They view dealing with nuclear waste as all political risks. So it's much easier for them to do nothing than to do something and then be held accountable to what it is. And when that thing is a nuclear thing, it's even that much worse. But here's why this particular issue is even worse than all that. The 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act, as a matter of law, said the federal government needs to start taking that waste off-site by 1998. 1998 comes and goes. The federal government takes zero waste. And so the utilities did what they should do, which is sue the federal government. And they won. So guess who pays for that? You and I pay for it. The Department of Energy doesn't pay for it. It's not even a budgeted item. Billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars, comes out of what's called the judgment fund. So we have a system now where the utilities have to take the waste to the curb, and then the federal government's supposed to get it. When the federal government doesn't come get it, the utilities take it back and then charge the federal government or us to to hold the waste. No one loses anything. All the interests are served except ours. That's why that system is a complete and utter failure. It's obsolete regulation. Maybe until yesterday, we treat nuclear energy like it's this magical new technology. It's neither magical nor new. It's well understood. Just ask these guys. It's well understood. We should regulate it as though it's well understood. We have a 70-year history of safe operations, yet our regulatory process is just layer upon layer upon layer over that. There have been efforts here and there to, on the margins, make it a little bit more efficient, but no one has really taken a look at the core of that regulation to see if we should do it better given this long history of safe operations, given what we now know about, or maybe always knew about low-dose radiation. But the whole regulatory process is obsolete. We have an empowered bureaucracy. This is part of what I was talking about when you keep such a huge chunk of the industry in the private sector or in the public sector. It's not just the regulator, though Bob and I might disagree on how big of a problem the regulator is, but it's not just the regulator. You have the whole Department of Energy who's making decisions through subsidies and grant programs about what technologies move forward, about who gets what, about all of these things, the things that should be business decisions. They need to be business decisions. A nuclear industry that works connects the front end of the fuel cycle to the back end of the fuel cycle. That means the fuel that's used, the type of fuel that's used, around through the reactor that's used, and how that waste is ultimately managed. That's how you build a cohesive, economically rational nuclear industry. But the federal government gets involved in each of those pieces, so you're never able to make the economics fully work. So the question might not be why nuclear, which is what we're here today because it's awesome, but why not nuclear? Why are we not making nuclear? Well, it's way too expensive. It's way too expensive. It doesn't need to be, and I'll talk about that here in a minute, but it is the nuclear waste issue. Should we be building nuclear reactors if we can't do anything with the waste? If government's is staying in the way, maybe we shouldn't be building them. And then there's the politics of it. The politics are good right now. No question about it. The politics are good. I would argue, though, that the politics can be fleeting. I hope they're not this time, but they certainly could be. The next time there's an accident, even if it's not a bad one, we'll see if they're fleeting or not. Well, buckle up, because here we go again. Another moment in nuclear. This is nuclear's third moment. And this is the one that I hope we end up calling the nuclear revolution. It started in 2020. And so we'll look at a little bit, what's driving that, the emissions reduction drive, the economical hydrocarbon alternative. We need access to reliable energy that, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that has become even a bigger issue than it was when we were worried about Middle East. And there's ongoing regulatory reform. There have been a number of efforts to reform the regulation in recent years. They haven't been finished yet, but they're ongoing. So let's see what has changed. There's growing demand from non-utility users. We already talked about that. The tech guys, the hyperscalers, the non-utilities. The challenges of intermittent energy have emerged in reality. It's not just guys like me saying, if you build a bunch of windmills and solar panels, you're going to have a problem. We're now seeing that it is a problem. The rise of competition from Russia and China. And then this one is important. We have change agents in charge. Now, aside whether you like the Trump people or not, they aren't afraid to be a bull in a china shop, and it's not always, every china shop doesn't deserve a bull, but some china shops do deserve bulls. And I would argue our nuclear policy is one of those. And that, I share with them the deep skepticism of federal bureaucracy and the regulatory structures, and they have this desire for the U.S. to lead in manufacturing and technology, and I certainly agree with that as well. So those things undermining this reform effort, I think, gives us a shot. And this is why I'm optimistic. Nuclear power is not inherently expensive. And I'll talk about each of these bullets in a little bit more detail. America's very first commercial nuclear plant was built in less than 5 years. They don't have to take a decade and a half to build. South Korea is demonstrating right now that they can build on time and on budget. As I mentioned, we have 70 years, literally 7 years of safe operating experience. We know how to do this. These guys know how to do this. And we, the United States used to own the nuclear industry. We led it. Every reactor pretty much in the Western world was fueled by American technology. We were it. We're not anymore. But we still are the United States, and we are still a technology leader. And if we get the policies right, we can be that leader again. And there's a specific identified problem. We have this grid reliability problem. We have massive demand potential, and there's just a ton of capital in the United States. These are all reasons that I'm optimistic right now. So here's just a few quick stats that might be interesting. Our first nuclear power plant, so this notion that they need to take a decade and a half, the first one we ever built took 3 years and 9 months. Like the first one we ever built. Like you'll hear people say, we need government intervention for this and that. We need to have the supply chain and like this was the first one. There wasn't an expansive supply chain then, but we did it in 3 years and 9 months. And before that, we built the first nuclear submarine in a similar amount of time when there was no nuclear submarine. But we built the first ever reactor that produced any electricity at all. It wasn't a commercial reactor in 2 years. So like there's nothing inherent about nuclear power that it has to take forever to build. And the cost was can you imagine if you could go into the market and say, I can build you a reactor in a couple of years for $1.36 billion, you'd sell a bajillion of them. You'd be the richest person in Princeton. All right, this is embarrassing because I made a huge mistake on this, but I'm going to own it, and rather than someone call me out on it. The Vogtle 3 and 4, that's 2 reactors combined, so you should really split that in half. So this is what nuclear could cost. In 1970s, adjusted for this is how much reactors cost in the 1970s, about $3 billion. This, the Olkiluoto reactor is built in Finland around the same time as our Vogtle 3 and 4 reactors. It's a French reactor. It costs about $12 billion. And the Vogtle reactors, that's 2 of them for $35. I don't know how I missed that, but I did. The point is that they used to be way less expensive. That point is appropriately communicated. South Korea recently built a series of reactors in the United Arab Emirates, and they did it. They would tell you on time and on budget. I'll tell you pretty much on time and pretty much on budget, better than what we did in Vogtle. The point is that South Korea has made great strides in building on time and on budget. And here we go. The average time to build is 8 years and 4 months. That's $6.1 billion per reactor. That's not bad given the economics of other Western efforts. So this is regarding the demand for electricity and what we have planned right now. This green line is just the energy demand, and the blue line is the nameplate capacity of what we're going to build, and the orange line is the actual capacity. So with any power producing system, there's like what it could produce, and if the sun shined 24 hours a day, or if the coal plant ran 24 hours a day, and then there's what the expected actual capacity of that thing would be. So a windmill runs about 30% and wind about the same. Nuclear power, on the other hand, runs around 95% of the time. And so this is just to show there's massive demand out there for electricity. But our policy response to all this has been the same. And this is where I get less optimistic. We have all this demand for new energy. We have enthusiasm again. We have a policy enthusiasm about it. So what do? The same thing we did last time, but on steroids. The IR energy subsidies put, a ton of money behind this stuff. A ton of money. And I don't know how it's going to work. I don't know how you end up, how subsidizing all of these things fixes anything. But that's the approach that we're taking once again. And so that's why I wrote this book, Nuclear Revolution. what nuclear revolution describes is how I think we can actually head in a different direction on nuclear energy, reform the regulation, get rid of the subsidies, fix nuclear waste management. And this came out towards the end of last year. And I'm happy to say that a lot of what I wrote about in here is in the executive orders that Trump just put out. So it's not one for one. I'm not saying that he read my book and did that. I'm saying that for the first time ever, people are having a serious policy conversation about LNT. That didn't happen just 6 months ago. I'm saying for the first time ever in a long time, people are having, not just like fringe guys like me, saying we need to really reform the NRC and how we do regulation. Like it's a real policy discussion. In those EOs, there's a real policy discussion about taking nuclear waste management out of the Department of Energy and giving it to someone else. The things that have to be done, that have to be addressed, aren't just subjects of interesting discussions over coffee. They are the direction that policy is moving in. And that's why, more than anything, I'm optimistic that this third nuclear moment may well be a revolution when we look back on it. And with that, oh, there's also if you guys want a book, there's some back there. And if there's not enough, I have a bag of them and I'll sign them for you if you want to. Thanks.
Okay, we're running late. What I'd suggest, frankly, is that don't be embarrassed if you have to leave. It's the 1 o'clock. But if you'd like to stay, I think we can stay a few more minutes and honor some questions and get some back and forth going. So let's give our three speakers a general thank you. And Richard has a microphone, is that right? Okay, you should go first.
I have a question about decommissioning cost. I mean, I think in nuclear power, decommissioning costs are always included in the cost, but with, say, solar and wind, they're not. In particular, solar cells, as I understand it, are highly toxic, but no one ever really talks about what it takes to dispose of that waste. And I just wonder if you would comment on that, because I don't know that comparison's actually ever made.
Well, for one thing, you have to worry about the sheer volume of materials in the two technologies. You are talking significant multiples of the basic building materials, concrete for the pads for the towers, steel, you name it. Plus, of course, all of the rare earths that have to go into the magnets and the generators that have to go into, it's a lot of stuff. And nuclear is a little better on that.
I think, just to be clear, part of what drives that dichotomy is that the regulations, federal regulations, actually require a nuclear power plant to pay as you go. That they're required every year to make a contribution to their decommissioning funds so that the fund is paid up. The other technologies don't have that requirement. So as a result, you end up with two different dialects of what's being discussed.
It's a similar thing with waste as well. Nuclear energy, as far as I know, is the only technology that's required to totally pay for its waste management up front.
Is thorium an important part of our future? And what problems are there with thorium?
So thorium is very interesting. Thorium reactors have been built. There's more of it out there than there is uranium. How long it's going to be till it's actually commercialized, I couldn't tell you. It is a possible fuel cycle. To be quite honest, I don't know quite enough about it. So,
yeah, what I would have said is a very, very confident maybe.
I'll give
like that. I like that.
I'll even
He wins.
I would say a couple other things though. We've actually built thorium reactors that have been successful breeding reactors. So there is some history there. One of the problems with the current regulatory structure is that they're built around a single technology, large light water reactors. And one of the things that I think is interesting about maybe where we're going is that that's going to loosen up a little bit. If you talk to the thorium guys, I mean, they would answer that question like, don't ask me about the future of thorium. The question you need to ask is the future of uranium, because they think it's so good. The point is, there's a lot of reactor technologies out there, and I think that a lot of them have a lot of promise because they all do something a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, there's the molten salt technology too that several people are working on. It runs at more or less atmospheric pressure. You don't have the water. You have a circulating bath. The guy that wrote that I took all of my material from, Jack Devaney, the MIT engineer, he founded a small modular reactor company. He did it in Indonesia because he didn't think it was possible here, and he's probably right. If you're not Bill Gates and willing to just, shovel $1 million bills in the direction of a startup. But the concept is a molten salt reactor that he's planning to build for a generating cost of 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And he's planning to use shipbuilding technology. He was a naval architect, essentially, at MIT. So he's intimately familiar with the manufacturing processes that are used in these big ocean-going vessels. And he thinks that basically technology would be applicable to building reactors. So we'll see where that goes. The company is called Thorcon. Interesting name, right? Maybe they were thinking about thorium originally, but if you go to their website now, you don't see a lot about thorium.
And I talk about thorium a bit in the book too, if you're interested.
I have a question here.
Hi, my name is Megan. Sorry, this isn't a direct question, but I wanted to say it before more people leave. I'm a current grad student here. I'm getting my doctorate in chemical engineering, and I specialize in system optimization and modeling. I'll be honest, I didn't know who sponsored this event. I'm actually quite progressive in my politics, and I was frankly unaware of the push for nuclear in the conservative aspect. I think politics are important, but not that important in the energy space, because this is not a partisan thing. This is a people thing. And so I'm well versed in the progressive politics, and obviously you guys are well versed in the conservative politics. And I think this energy transformation is going to span multiple presidential terms, congressional terms, all those things. It needs to be something that has bipartisan support. So if anyone is open to it, I would like to have a conversation with you guys. You all seem to be influential people, and I would kind of like to know where it's at. I think knowing the current state of everybody, not just your party, is going to help us move forward. Because this is very important. I didn't know this was happening, and I don't think a lot of progressives know this is happening. We want the same things. Does that make sense? I don't know if that was out of line, but yeah.
One thought I'll give you, just following up on that, is I think right now there's broad agreement on what I'll call the objectives and the outcomes. Where there are discussions are means and methods to achieve this. And that's where I think everyone does need to be talking and listening to each other, because I think everybody has something to offer.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, Sarah.
Fusion.
We'll get over that.
Any thoughts on fusion? Where do you think that falls into the scope?
I think fusion offers promise. Personally, it's not quite as close as the press would lead you.
What I will say to that is I think that fusion may be possible, but I think it's very difficult to make inexpensive, okay? A fission reactor, you pile enough of the right stuff together, it gets hot. It's just not that hard. Fusion reaction, you're trying to build a piece of a star. That's a big lift. ITER, the European fusion experiment, is about the most expensive machine ever built by humans. You're not going to make them by the dozens.
I'll add a slightly different perspective. I think it'll be ready when we need it. I think the biggest obstacle to fusion is not the technology, not the cost or anything. We just don't need it. So we have hydrocarbons, we have fission, we have so many other things. So the capital, the manpower, the brain power needed to take fusion to that next level, it's not required at this point. So that's why
I think it's fine. You know, you have these private companies that are popping up that are continuing to forward it, and that's great. I think that it has a ton of promise and it'll be there.
We have a question here.
Yeah, thank you.
Just add one more point to that. You probably are aware that Princeton is a world leader in fusion. We've got a huge program going for many, many years. They've done many groundbreaking experiments with lots of amazing results. And again, from a personal perspective, when I was graduating in '68, I was tempted to join the fusion program at that point. And the thought was, well, we're 20 years away from commercial fusion at that point. So just a personal story.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you for doing this panel. It's really exceptional. I mean, Jack D, I read your newsletter all the time, and it's really great. I guess my question, I want to focus on the geopolitical stuff. I'm curious if you guys have a perspective on the Saudi nuclear deal. I know during Trump 1, it was they were looking at 16 reactors. Obviously, with the last week, maybe that's coming back online. The UAE, kind of the agreements with AI, it's going to be something that these countries need in order to kind of power both their local population and probably stay geopolitically relevant. And then number two, I'm curious how you think about kind of the US exporting technologies. Obviously, the export of reactors to India and leading to the bomb in '74 caused difficulties. It's part of the reason why Russia can use it as a geopolitical instrument and we can't. I'm curious if you see things like thorium as one opportunity there for developing non-proliferant fuel cycles in a more feasible way so that we can export this technology to more countries. So I'll pause there, but those are the two I'm most interested in.
So let me address your second point. Now I feel more strong. The Saudi thing, I think that we need to compete on that, and that will be what it is. Where I think the most important issue on that is with the 123 agreement. We should look at every 123 agreement as specific to the country with whom we're doing it. And I think that with Saudi, it gets mixed up. Anyway, I'm not as interested in that. What I am interested in, though, is this technology export piece. Because the United States, we just have to acknowledge a few realities. One is that we're not the global leader in nuclear energy technology anymore. So for us to use export controls and all of these things and try to act like that's going to stop proliferation, I don't think that's that's not a realistic approach any longer. The other thing is, grant you, India is a big exception. But the countries who use nuclear technology to build weapons, we know who they are. And no one's surprised when they do it. We don't lack intelligence or technology to know that what we lack is a political will to do anything about it. And so my view is, if you suspect a country's going to use nuclear technology to build a weapon, you probably shouldn't be engaging in nuclear trade with them to begin with. But I say let her rip everywhere else. I guess that's not the technical term, but that's really what I think, because that's if we don't, someone else will. We can engage in that nuclear trade in as safe a way as possible. And I think there's just a ton of opportunity. And that's going to be key to getting our domestic industry back up and running. And we need, part of being competitive in that world is building really strong relationships with countries who are on their way to doing it, like South Korea, like Japan. It's that united front, us, South Korea, Japan, Canada, UK, that's going to be able to compete with Russia and China. And then the last part that I'll say, in order for us to be successful, we need to be able to manage the back end of the fuel cycle, and we need to be able to enrich uranium. If we can't give them soup to nuts nuclear alternatives, of course they're going to buy a Chinese reactor. Of course they are. So it's really important, and we need to make being able to compete on these things, on this international growth of nuclear, I think, a policy priority.
I will. That triggered a thought from me about the whole proliferation issue. To some extent, the proliferation issue is almost out of the bag now, because with the laser isotope separation technologies that are coming online, you really don't have any good way of, you don't have anything to control. The centrifuges use parts that are relatively unique. It's kind of pretty easy to tell when somebody's buying a bunch of centrifuges. It's a whole lot harder when you have processes like Silex, S-I-L-E-X, out there, which do it by laser separation of the isotopes. That hopefully will get us another factor of 2. So the old gas diffusion model of enrichment's hugely expensive. The centrifuges drop that by a factor of 20 or so. You might get another factor of 2 out of the laser separation processes, but they're also small. They're easy to hide. You know, you could build one in a big room. It's not like you're going to have banks of thousands of these centrifuges. So it's really pretty damn difficult to stop proliferation because technology marches on. The things you would like to control aren't necessarily going to be crucial anymore.
Okay, I think we can claim success. Thank you very much for coming. Once again, let's thank our speakers.